Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here with us on this chilly, chilly night. I'm Amy Ng, Peter J. Sharp, Chief Curator here at the Frick. Thank you for joining us at tonight's event, which celebrates the work of one of the museum's esteemed curatorial fellows. So for those of you who don't know, the Frick appoints one doctoral student in art history each year as the Anne L. Poulet Curatorial Fellow. And they work with us in the curatorial department for 2 years, acquiring experience, a few tiers, as a full member of the department, doing the daily tasks and becoming museum professionals, as well as working on their own research projects and completing their dissertations. It's a lot to do in 2 years. Since the fellowship was established in 2002, we've welcomed 22 curatorial fellows. And it started with a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. In 2012, we renamed it the Anne L. Poulet Curatorial Fellowship in honor of the Frick's then director, Anne L. Poulet. We're very proud of the Curatorial Fellowship program because our fellows have gone on to take illustrious posts as curators at many great institutions around this country and in Europe and elsewhere in the world. At the Cleveland Art Museum, for example, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, the National Gallery in London. There are 2 former Frick Fellows at the Met, the Art Institute of Chicago, and so on. And there was one fellow who was chief curator here for 11 years before becoming director at the Gulbenkian Museum in London. I think tonight's speaker, Geoffrey Ripert, may be the very first of our fellows to move directly from being a fellow to being in charge of developing a whole new museum. Geoffrey has recently been appointed head of collections for the Château de Dampierre on Yvelines, which is a sprawling 17th century estate and art collection still in private hands about an hour southwest of Paris. And Geoffrey has generously invited all of us to visit him there in Dampierre, where one of the perks of his job is that he gets to keep an apartment at the castle. So do let him know when you've booked your flights. Geoffrey Ripert has had a long history with us at the Frick. After completing his master's degree at the École du Louvre in Paris in 2015, he served as curatorial assistant for decorative arts here at the Frick from 2016 to 2020. He also began his PhD program at the Bard Graduate Center here in the city, where his dissertation explores the taste for marble and hard stone objects in France during the long 18th century. That's about 1700 to 1815. And Geoffrey returned to the Frick 2 years ago as our curatorial fellow. And his fellowship was unlike any other. It coincided with the move from Frick Madison and the reopening of this building as the Frick back in its historical buildings. And he contributed to the installation of decorative arts, the study of decorative arts in the galleries that you see throughout the mansion. He's given stellar presentations and gallery talks, including just last night an extraordinary seminar looking closely at jewelry and decorative arts objects in the collection. And as you'll see, he's also made dazzling discoveries and insights on the fabulous topic he will present tonight in a lecture entitled Precious Legacies, Jewelry and Portraits of the Frick Collection. And this lecture will be published in a forthcoming book, so look out for that next year. Please join me in welcoming Geoffrey Ripert to the podium.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that extremely generous introduction. I'm very, very grateful. I myself cannot believe that it's been now 10 years since I first started at the Frick in 2015, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you tonight to talk to you about this project that I've been working on for the past year and a half, almost 2 years now. But before beginning, I just want to acknowledge and just thank the Frick Collection, starting with Amy Nang, of course, the director, Axel Ruger, and indeed the entire curatorial and educational team here at the Frick, who have been so generous and so helpful and supportive. It's so wonderful to be surrounded by such intelligent and supportive people and such a wonderful team. So thank you so much. Without further ado, I will start the presentation here, and I have broken this presentation down into 3 parts, which are all related to a specific painting in the collection. So it follows a chronological order, and I start here with the late 15th century and progress through to the 19th century, and conclude with a little nod to the Fricks themselves and their relationship to jewellery, which I think is something that's been seldom explored thus far, and that I hope you'll find as interesting as I did as I was researching the topic. And I entitle this first part Between Illusion and Reality. And one of the reasons for this is because, and I've chosen this fantastic portrait, Jan Vos here, that you can see on the side here. We actually had a previous fellow, Emma Capron, who's now at the National Portrait Gallery in London, who did a fabulous focus exhibition on this work here. And I think it's a great way to start this journey into the history of the representation of jewellery. Partly because Van Eyck was known, indeed with a number of other painters at the time, for representing a sort of exaggerated vision of jewellery. What we're seeing here is an extraordinary work that has, in fact, details that I can show you here. And it's fantastic that you can see them in such great focus here on this presentation. Thanks to our fantastic new auditorium. And as you can see here, there are some extraordinary, exquisite details of this different jewellery that you can see here. But what we're seeing actually in reality are not real jewels and gems as we understand them today. These are evocations of what one might have had and might have seen, particularly in church treasuries, for example, at the time, which very commonly up until, certainly in France, up until the Revolution, contained vast quantities of religious items made from the finest materials available. And I want to sort of take you through some of the equivalents of objects that existed at the time that Van Eyck and his studio painted this work. To give you a sense of some of the works that might have inspired Van Eyck and his studio to create a piece like this. Here you're seeing a fabulous piece that was actually made a century before the painting, the so-called Clasp of Saint-Louis, that is part of the French regalia and miraculously survived the French Revolution and many turmoils to this day. And you can sense sort of a similarity in terms of taste, in terms of style, with these great stones here, amethysts and in this case emeralds, that are literally set into silver gilt here. And left in what is known as a cabochon cut. And so cabochon, really what we mean by that is a stone that has not been faceted. And part of the reason why, until really I would say the late 17th century, why this cut tended to be favoured is because it's partly due to the fact that in Europe, the technology to develop, to facet these different stones and gems had not yet been developed. And so it was also stylistic, of course, but part of the reason was also related to technological progress that progressively allowed these stones to be faceted. So what I'm showing you here are really some of the objects that could have inspired Van Eyck in seeing these, in producing this work, and indeed some of the other paintings that he made at the time. That would have been available certainly on festival days, for example, that would have been used, for example, in the case of a crown such as this, might have been placed on the top of the statue of the Virgin Mary and paraded on festival days throughout the streets of any particular town. And indeed, this type of tradition of commissioning coronets and crowns to be placed atop the statues of votive saints and Virgin Marys was and still is active in some parts of Europe today, particularly in Italy and southern France and Spain. And this particular example I think is very, very interesting. It's an extraordinarily rare holdover, a sort of vestige of the 15th century that has remained fairly intact in its original appearance, that was made originally as a coronet for a person, so for Margaret of York, and then eventually donated by her precisely to adorn the statue of the Virgin Mary in Germany, and eventually made its way to the treasury of Aachen Cathedral, where it still sits today, where it still is preserved. And what's very, very interesting here is you can actually see some of the earlier cuts and the kind of early sort of setting of these stones. First of all, an enormous pearl in the center here that sort of designates the front part of this coronet. And also, very interestingly, cross of Jerusalem here that's represented in the center of the band that is made from a series of different diamonds that are placed and positioned in order to build this cross. And one interesting fact that you might notice is that actually in some earlier paintings, and I would say this is true really through to the 16th century, the representation of diamonds tends to be quite dark. And this is also partly related to the faceting technology that was not quite on point, not up to the sort of standards of the brilliant cut that we now know as the standard for diamonds today. And so hence diamonds were represented fairly dark because the light was not refracted as well as it could be when it is cut in multiple facets. I also want to briefly talk to you about some of the extraordinary stories that underpin the symbolic history, I would say, and associations of some of these gems. And I had to choose the pearl, the birth of the pearl, as a particularly interesting example here. And what you're seeing here is a representation of the birth of the pearl, according to Pliny the Elder, in his ninth book of Naturalis Historiae, the natural history, which were extremely influential books all the way through to the 18th century and underpinned much of Western culture. And he recounts a very interesting anecdote about the birth of the pearl, saying that apparently these mollusks, according to him and his contemporaries, would actually rise up, swim up to the surface of the ocean or of any body of water they might naturally find themselves in, and then open up in the early morning hours to receive a fertilizing dew, which would actually then produce the pearl. And depending on the purity of said dew, you would receive, you would obtain a more or less white and pure pearl. And hence then the natural association with the virginal conception of Christ, and indeed with femininity and fertility, which is to a certain extent still extant and still relevant today, since we still gift pearls for women today. The association with women and female jewelry is still very much a contemporary one today. So we can see that even though the scientific, of course, backing and sort of scientific underpinning of this story is known to be untrue today, it still carries with us this legacy of symbolic associations that is very, very powerful. Now, how about the makers? Who are the makers of these things and of these jewels, and who are the goldsmiths? Very interesting because there is relatively little information about artisans really before the Renaissance, and even at that point it was quite new for artists, for example, to sign their works. And so I just wanted to show you here a very, very interesting painting that is often cited and often used by jewelry specialists in the literature. Which I think is absolutely fascinating, by Petrus Christus, and representing a goldsmith in his shop that is at the Met, just opposite, just about 10 minutes down the road, if you're interested. And I've sort of zoomed in on this, the sort of the vitrine, almost the shop vitrine that he has at the back here. Really, really interesting to see that you have here a pouch containing a mass of smaller pearls. On the side here, you have shark teeth, you have some rubies, some spinels as well, bearing in mind that spinels and rubies, being both red stones, would have been confused at this time. There wasn't really a scientific distinction between the two, and some larger pearls here. We also have interesting, some rock crystal, coral at the back here, so all the materials that the jeweler and the goldsmith and the jewelry maker would have used. And I particularly like the shark's teeth that are mounted here at the back, which, personally, I don't know about you, but shark's teeth, mounted perhaps on a necklace sort of reminds me of the image of the strapping young Australian surfer. But apparently this is an older idea than I initially thought. Anyway, so on the side here, just to finish on this image, which is decidedly fascinating, I just think it's so moving and touching to see that this box containing, a series of different rings, which could have been used for engagements, weddings, all sorts of different important events. It could be a contemporary box in Tiffany's or in a contemporary jeweler's shop today. You can really sense how this idea of gifting rings and important jewels has been with us for a very, very long time and is an ancient tradition. So onwards now to the 18th century, so quite a jump there in terms of chronology. And I'm really happy also to talk a little bit about Miss Mary Edwards, a fantastic portrait, very, very idiosyncratic, really interesting and unusual in a myriad number of ways. This young lady died at the age of 38, and she had a very, very interesting and unusual life so far as she happened to fall in love with a certain Lord Anne Hamilton. And although it's not completely certain that she actually married him, she might have, but then again might not have. What we do know is that at some point, very, very soon after, about 2 or 3 years after the relationship began and a son was produced from this union, she decided that she'd had enough of her spendthrift husband and promptly decided to recover her fortune, which was absolutely sizable at the time, estimated between 50 to 60,000 pounds at the time in 18th century British money, which is an enormous sum, and would have made her reputedly the richest woman in England. And since she wasn't too happy about her husband apparently gambling away her fortune, she decided to recover said fortune and eventually succeeded. And only a really short time after this painting was painted by William Hogarth, of which she was a patron, almost as a form of celebration of her newfound status as an independent woman. I mean, absolutely striking and really fascinating to see that so early on we have an almost feminist take here, but an important woman certainly, who is really deciding to essentially retake her own life in her own hands. And she also has an array of really interesting jewels. But before I start talking about those, I want to quickly talk to you about the history of gem cutting as a sort of to underpin the sort of next few minutes of exploration of this particular portrait. And what you're seeing here is both an engraving and also a wonderful painting by the fantastic painter Nicolas de Largillière, representing a decidedly eccentric man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who's also very, very well known to jewelry specialists and jewelry historians. And this man actually went on several different trips to India and to the southern eastern Asia. And brought back a quantity of very, very important diamonds, part of which were then sold to various different important figures of the European courts, in particular Louis XIV. And the reason why I mention this chap here is because he sort of sold a number of these different diamonds to Louis XIV. And what's interesting is actually that he then publicized his different diamonds and the different stones that he was able to sell to these different patrons. And what we have here is quite interesting in terms of gem cutting, because it gives you an idea of the different sort of styles of cut that were available in various forms in late 17th century and even in early 18th century Europe. And what you're seeing at the sort of top left-hand corner here is what's known as a table cut. This is actually also a table cut. It's a much, much larger diamond, but it does give you a sense of what we know as a table cut. And what I mean by that is essentially the diamond in its natural form comes as a kind of pyramid or a cube, if you like. And what early gem cutters did is that they literally just shaved the top off the top of the diamond in order to produce what is known as this table. And that was really the basis of the earliest cuts beyond the cabochon natural sort of non-faceted sort of presentation of diamonds that I mentioned earlier on. And then this then evolved into a slightly more complex cut in what is known as the rose cut here, which you can see in this huge great diamond here, the Great Mogul diamond, characterized by this very triangulated pattern, made using sort of very, very careful faceting on a wheel, which would have produced this particular result. And I want to thank my friend and colleague Courtney Stewart here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who was very, very helpful in providing sort of a very new research from her PhD in particular. And she speaks about this, an intermediary cut that you're seeing here as I'm speaking, which she actually coins the term Mogul brilliant cut, which is a sort of an intermediary between the cutting styles that I showed earlier on, and the so-called brilliant cut, which has now become a staple for gem cutting and for jewelers today. And as you can see, it's quite different. I'll show you an example of a brilliant cut afterwards, but this was a type of cut that was favored in India and by Indian gem cutters. And really, the characteristics of this cut is that you can see this sort of elliptical porthole in the center of the diamond. And what they tried to do, one of the priorities for Indian gem cutters in particular, and for the Indian courts, was to maintain a maximum amount of weight of the original stone, which is not the case for European cutters. And so this allowed, the gem in itself to sort of express sort of the maximum amount of light, whilst also retaining a maximum amount of weight. And eventually what happens by the late 17th and really 18th century is that you see in Europe in particular the development of this so-called brilliant cut, which is now the standard. And this happens to be a very, very famous diamond that is today at the Louvre and has not been stolen. It's an enormous diamond. Originally, I believe it was 426 carats, if my memory serves me. It was discovered in 1698 in the mines of Golconda, India, which was one of the only main source of diamonds until the discovery in the 1720s and 30s of Brazilian diamonds that then flooded the market and completely changed the game in terms of gem cutting and prices for diamonds. But this is an earlier period, and it was cut actually by the governor of Madras, Thomas Pitt, and then eventually sold to Philippe d'Orléans, the regent, the regent of France, who then sort of kept it and maintained it within the French royal collections, and where it remains to this day. Fantastic diamond. It's now 140 carats, but an enormous stone, very, very, unique. And you can see here, its original presentation in the Louvre. Today, it's now actually in the Bank of France for safekeeping, along with the Hortensia and the Sancy, two other absolutely extraordinary stones that are among the most important diamonds in the world today and some of the most beautiful. So back to Miss Mary Edwards and her veritable cascade of diamonds. My goodness me, she really is, as one author put it, piling on the bling here. And indeed, it is very, very unusual to have a non-royal sitter. Bearing in mind she was aristocratic, of course, born from a Dutch-born aristocratic family on her mother's side and from an English aristocratic family on her father's side, both of whom were extraordinarily wealthy, which allowed her to inherit this sizable fortune of about 50 to 60,000, pounds by the time she was 21. But nonetheless, it's very, very unusual to have such a piling on of diamonds and such a regal style portrait. And I give you here an example of a contemporaneous portrait that was painted of Augusta of Saxe-Coburg, who was Princess of Wales, and she was actually married to someone who was supposed to be the heir to the throne of England, who actually died prematurely. But you can sense here a similarity in the style of this huge, great pendant that she's wearing on her neck here. But really, honestly, I wonder if actually Miss Mary Edwards' pendant cross is actually not more impressive than that of the Princess of Wales, which goes to show you the real statement that she's making here. It is really something that's quite unusual. And portraits of this type representing a sitter that is non-royal, fully frontally faced here, staring directly at the audience, at the viewer, are very unusual indeed, and really extraordinary. So she is really making a statement here. And I'm showing you here another example of a slightly later portrait by Martin van Metens that was made of the Duchess of Teschen. Talking about piling on the bling, my goodness me, I don't know how she managed to survive, just standing up with so many diamonds. Because these things were terribly weighty, extraordinarily, difficult to wear for long periods of time because they are quite weighty indeed. Particularly when you combine that with the whalebone stays that would have come as well with textiles and sort of a piling on of different textiles and different the setting of the stones as well. And generally speaking, in order to alleviate the weight, they actually made it from openwork, and so that was typical of the 18th century innovations in terms of gem setting. You would put it in silver first of all for transparent diamonds to set them off as best as possible, and also with this openwork to try and alleviate the weight. But just, the comparison between the two, I think Miss Mary Edwards is still very much in competition here, despite the fact that, this is the daughter of the Empress of Austria. So it's really quite interesting to see that there is a real status that she's claiming here. And I just wanted to briefly also mention the idea of cost, of price. It's sort of rather controversial here, but just to give you an idea of just the sheer scale of expenditure of something like what Miss Mary Edwards is wearing here. We have this engraving, which is actually we don't actually know in what context it was produced. It's sort of, jewelry history and jewelry research is still, at the beginning, at the commencement to a certain extent. So we don't always have all the information and the records to be able to determine some of these questions that are so interesting, I think. But just to give you an example here, we have this engraving that is anonymous, produced, roughly around the same period, a little bit later, for a diamond necklace that is smaller, and this was worth 1.6 million livres. I mean, we're talking about a sum that is sufficient to buy a country chateau or a townhouse. It's an enormous sum of money. And when you look at Miss Mary Edwards' necklace, I mean, it is bigger, actually. It's bigger. So, she's basically wearing a townhouse on her neck. And it's just, good for her. I wish I could say the same. Not yet. And I'm just showing you here, just to finish off with Miss Mary Edwards, so much that one can say, but I do want to be aware of the time here. These are the so-called Sutherland diamonds that were worn by the Duchesses of Sutherland before being surrendered to the V&A. They eventually deposited there as part of an inheritance agreement. And these are very, very rare 18th century cut brilliant diamonds. So speaking about the brilliant cut, this is very typical of an 18th century brilliant cut style. Just look at the size of these things. I mean, just compared to the hand, you're getting a sense of just how large they were. So this would be worth absolutely millions today, and certainly was extraordinarily expensive when they were first cut. And in this particular case, actually were reputedly taken from the original necklace that was at the center of the affair of the diamond necklace that enswirled the court of France, and particularly Marie Antoinette, and was ultimately her downfall. So interesting that there's that sort of history attached to it, although it's difficult to determine whether or not this is true in this particular case. Just an equivalent here that is made from topaz, not from diamond. So for those of us, in the 18th century, if we were living in that period who could not afford the diamonds, the real thing, you could always have topaz, which is much, much more affordable. But again, interesting to compare the style here, because we're looking at, and originally actually when I saw this portrait, I thought to myself, it's very odd because it seems a much later style, almost seems neoclassical in its outlook. And indeed, in fact, it is not. I mean, it is very much, according to the conservation reports and the curatorial files that we have here, most definitely painted at the same time in the 1740s. So she was really ahead of the curve. I mean, very interesting indeed to see just how ahead of fashion trends she was. Really interesting. Fantastic chatelaine watch as well that she's wearing here. Unfortunately for Miss Mary Edwards, speaking of records, we don't have her inventory after death. I was unable to locate it. It might be somewhere in private archives, but it unfortunately is not in the National Archives in England, alas. But we do have a record that she did once, when she died, there was a sale that was conducted of all her plate and rich jewels, but unfortunately that catalogue has also been lost, so we are left to speculation in this particular case, unfortunately. But just giving you an equivalent here, so this is what we know as a chatelaine. So the chatelaine is the pendant here, this sort of chain here, which is actually an erroneous term. It was known as an équipage in the 18th century, but progressively, sort of through semantic deformation, we ended up calling it collectively now today a chatelaine, and the pocket watch here. We also have a fantastic, examples. The galleries are open until I think 8:30, I believe. So for those of you who want to see our new clocks and watches room upstairs, fabulous display with absolutely gorgeous pocket watches from the 17th and 18th centuries, including this one. Just look at the quality of the chasing. I mean, it's absolutely mind-blowing. Beautiful object there indeed. And just to finish here with Miss Mary Edwards here, you're seeing a trade card that coincides with the period during which the painting was made. It actually has chatelaine watches hanging from the side. So these types of objects were typical of London and Paris in the 18th century, and they became the centers of production of luxury objects of this nature. There are also some wonderful designs here on the right-hand side of chatelaine watches made in Paris, which would have been presented to clients before they were made. So really, really interesting to see that, I think. So onwards to the chrysoprase parure of Comtesse d'Arru. And what on earth is chrysoprase, you might be thinking? Well, I will explain it to you. So for the Comtesse d'Arru, we're very lucky because actually we do have her inventory after death, which you can see here on the screen. This inventory after death was made after she died in 1815, and we are very lucky to have an absolute complete inventory of almost every element in the painting, which is extremely rare. I was absolutely delighted, elated when I found this. And I want to thank actually Joy Cador, who helped me secure this inventory since I was traveling at the time. So I really want to thank her for that. Fantastic to have all these different objects that are listed in the inventory in great detail in this particular case. And if you look at the name in the center of the screen here, it's not completely obvious, but it will become more obvious with this slide. It was a man named Mellerio Meller, and he was actually the one who conducted the estimate, the valuation of her jewelry after she died. And he was part of a very important dynasty of jewelers and makers of sort of small trinkets and luxury objects, who emigrated from northern Italy to France in the early 17th century, and by the late 18th became official court jewelers to Marie Antoinette, of all people. And believe it or not, they still exist today. And you're seeing actually here a late 19th century picture of the original shop, which was then transformed somewhat and is still today active as a business, independently owned, on the Rue de la Paix in Paris, should you be interested. Comtesse d'Arru was a very interesting figure, and she was married to a very important man in the Napoleonic administration known as Pierre d'Arru. And this man had a characteristic, I would say, Napoleonic career, insofar as he was born to actually a noble family that were knighted, sort of ennobled quite late in his father's career through his mayorship of the capitale of Toulouse, from which he was originated from. And he actually started as an apprentice with the intendant, the so-called governor of Languedoc in southwestern France. And then made his way to Paris eventually and was known as a workaholic, which is one of the reasons why Napoleon sort of picked him up and he really became a trusted confidant, to the point where he actually became intendant de la Grande Armée. So he accompanied Napoleon on his different campaigns throughout Europe, and in particular Prussia, Germany, and eventually also Poland, and partly in Russia as well. And he had the absolutely extraordinary honor of having his name added to the list of names of generals and important Napoleonic figures onto the Arc of Triumph that still is today on the eastern pillar of the Arc of Triumph today. So really an important person who was also responsible for the Maison de l'Empereur, the household of the Emperor Napoleon. And he eventually rented, I should say, a property on the Place Vendôme. It's very interesting that, the jewelry history sort of comes around and around. But Comtesse d'Arru and Pierre d'Arru lived on the Place Vendôme, which is now actually the seat of Van Cleef & Arpels. So it's quite interesting to see that their own house is now still a jewelry store. So it's rather interesting with what regards jewelry history. And my goodness me, did they live lavish lives. So the inventory lists their silverware, just the plates. So we have about 140 plates worth listed in this inventory, bearing in mind that it's just the Paris property that was the weight of a full-grown man, just in silver, so really extraordinary. They also had, they boasted a very, very nice wine cellar, which I would not mind, I wouldn't mind having that one. 1,700 bottles from various different parts of the country, in France, Spain, also Rhineland wines of all sorts. And they even had 119 bottles of their own estate, vineyards in Becheville, which was just outside Paris. Although I have to admit to you that for 119 bottles, they were valued at 72 francs. So I don't think the Parisian climate made miracles in terms of taste, I'm afraid. Still to this day, we can try, but Piquette is there's a reason why it's called that. Bad French wine from Paris. Anyway, so more to the point, there is a list of her jewelry in this particular inventory. And I was delighted to find this specific chrysoprase parure that is represented in the portrait by David, listed very, very carefully, and it contained no less than 450 diamonds in this complete parure. And what you're seeing actually, what she's wearing in the painting actually happens to be in Paris now. It's back in its native lands to a certain extent, for the David show that will go on until January, I believe, and then before it comes back to the Frick. But 450 diamonds, because this was actually not just a necklace and a pair of earrings. There was actually a second necklace and a second pair of earrings, and also a head comb, a sort of small tiara that contained also chrysoprase stones and diamonds as well. Really extraordinary. And it was not even the most expensive item in her inventory. It was only the 5th most expensive item. She also had 2 rivières, so known as rivières, so sort of large diamond, transparent diamond necklaces as well, that were very, very important for her. Now, where does chrysoprase come from, and what is this stone? It's an unusual stone, I think, for us today, although I did actually see a New York Times article recently that said that chrysoprase is back in terms of style, so maybe I'm more on point than I thought, but it's a sort of chance of research here. But the original location of, the main, really, location of it in 18th century Europe was Silesia, which was originally, so at this time, as of the 1750s, belonged to Prussia. And what happened actually in 1808 is that Comte Daru was actually stationed there with Napoleon. And I believe, although I didn't actually find specific records to prove this, but I'm sort of a very strong proponent of the fact that I think what happened is that when engineers were sent to Silesia to govern this occupied territory in 1808 when he was stationed there, and indeed actually the Countess came to see him in Berlin when he was there, they picked up a number of different stones, including chrysoprase ones, and then he had them made in Paris for her. And I think this is quite typical of what happened to sort of important personages of the empire. Also possible that Napoleon actually gifted these stones to him, but I think given his strategic position in Silesia, really at the height of the empire, I think it's more likely that he actually obtained them himself. But this is where they came from. So Silesia, this region that is now part of Poland and was long disputed all throughout its history, a very bloody history indeed. But it was found in outcroppings. And as early as the 1750s, we have records, actually quite detailed ones, by a certain Johann Lehmann, who in the 1750s published an entire sort of brochure, as it were, sort of an academic lecture in front of the Academy of Berlin, speaking of chrysoprase and its extraction in Silesia. And it was found in natural outcroppings in the forest. And he spoke about the fact that actually some of the best pieces of it were found on the surface in forests. And you just literally had to clear the mud and then just dig down and find it in these sort of interesting natural occurrences here. So quite difficult to work as well, because you have to sort of work with all these different inclusions, impurities, and so on and so forth. So not easy to work into stones. And it's one of the reasons why most of the time when it was used, it was not faceted, because the faceting apparently would ruin the appearance of these stones, and they preferred the cabochon cut. Now, one mystery that I had when looking at this particular necklace is that normally, really from the 18th century through to the 19th, the inclusion of diamonds in a parure is a sign that you're looking at evening wear. And one of the reasons for this is because diamonds sparkle, and indeed transparent stones tend to obviously to sparkle, and that's the whole point. And so they were preferred in the evening when they would be best used and sort of put to their best use there. And I thought to myself, it's rather strange then that they would include an opaque stone such as chrysoprase with it. But the answer lied in John Moore, the mineralogist, the British mineralogist's words here. And he actually, I haven't actually seen this effect myself. I'd love to, but it's not one that I've actually seen with my own eyes. But chrysoprase does glow in the evening. And so you have to imagine Comtesse Daru looking absolutely spectacular in her silk white dress, sort of hosting guests, including the Empress Josephine herself, in her Place Vendôme salon, with the spark of candlelight, silver candlesticks and mirrors reflecting off of her glowing chrysoprase parure and diamonds. She must have looked absolutely spectacular, and it was part of the reason why I think she perhaps chose this specific ensemble to be worn for her portrait for posterity. In terms of model, moving on from the stone and the substance itself to the actual model of this particular parure. The idea of the parure, so just to explain very quickly, it's essentially just a matching set of jewels, which generally includes a necklace, a pair of earrings, normally also a pair of bracelets, and a belt. and sometimes some additional elements as well. And you're seeing here a wonderful example, which is almost identical, except with amethysts, that was made for the Comtesse Villain XIV, who was also an important figure in the Napoleonic court, around the same time. And this is very, very typical. So this style of parure with sort of stones that are then circled with a ring of diamonds here. In this case, the intermediary stones are actually not diamond, they're amethysts. So amethysts would have been slightly less expensive, so sort of a slightly less costly option for potential clients that didn't want to pay as much as the Darus here, but the model is very much identical, and you can just see the comparison here, how closely they match in terms of style and model here. So it's very, very contemporaneous. We're exactly in this sort of First Empire style. And another example here of also sort of a similar construction, a similar style necklace. Some of these stones are slightly later, but the actual necklace itself was made around the same time, around the 1810s. This is actually in the V&A today, and it's made from emeralds. And interestingly, you can actually see how clever the jeweler and the gem layer, sort of the gem setter rather, has been, because of the color of the emeralds, they've used gold to highlight the stone because it looks better with gold. But for the diamonds, it's silver. So the combination between the two really sets off the stones in the best possible way. It's really very clever. And this is a wonderful portrait here of a very, very similar parure in style that is worn by Queen Hortense de Beauharnais, who was the sister of Empress Josephine and who married Napoleon's brother and then produced the third Napoleon, who then reigned during the Second Empire. And I want to now sort of conclude, as it were, with sort of a nod to the Fricks and their jewellery. And I thought this was an interesting way of connecting all this history, through the portraits to the Fricks themselves. And I wondered, actually, it was sort of a question I had, what the relationships the Fricks had to their own jewels, and indeed to the representations of jewellery in the portraits that they had in this fabulous collection. And I actually, first of all, I want to thank Caitlin Henderson-Ford for first putting me on the track here. She forwarded an important correspondence that was very useful, actually, and also Julie Ludwig, our resident archivist here, who was absolutely fantastic in helping me with the research here. And we have here a fantastic portrait, a photographic portrait by Benjamin Folk of Mrs. Frick, Mrs. Adelaide Frick, looking very glamorous here, with a very, very interesting and rather ornate pearl necklace. So again, pearls, we're sort of seeing the tradition of pearl wearing for women that is still very active in the beginning of the 20th century. And my thoughts were, when looking at a lot of these photographs of the Frick women in particular, of Helen, her daughter, and of Adelaide in particular, I thought to myself, they look quite modest, and I don't think they spent too much on jewellery. My goodness me, was I wrong. And you can see here just an example of some of the vouchers that were pulled from the archives here for just 2 Oriental pearls. And we're speaking here just 7 years after sort of 6 to 7 years after this portrait was taken of her. Just for 2 pearls, which were probably quite large and were used probably for a necklace, she paid, the Fricks paid $118,000. Just to put that into perspective, that is the price of the 2 Kanchi Chinese ladies on stands that are today sort of the pride and joy of the living hall and are still in the Frick collection today. And I thank actually Yifu Liu for pointing that out to me. So it's the same price as 2 huge porcelain statues of great value. Or to put it another way, if she had bought 18 of these pearls to make, for example, a sautoir or a necklace, it would have been an equivalent price, roughly, to the entire suite of Fragonards in the Fragonard room. So it's an enormous expense. I mean, it's really, just for 2 Oriental pearls, I mean, it's quite a lot. And she actually had another necklace, a clasp, a diamond and pearl clasp that was made for $130,000, just to add to a pre-existing necklace for $130,000. So enormous sums. There's also a 1931 inventory here, which I find very, very interesting, and which lists all of the possessions of the Fricks at the time of Adelaide's death in sort of the 1930s. And in fact, here, lo and behold, we have the diamond fleur de lis sort of brooch that is in her hair here, and the different materials that are listed, with one large pearl, another black one, and also coral surrounded by diamonds. And I think it has to be this one because there's no other record of any other. So it's interesting to see that this matches up here. Very interesting indeed. And they had a lot of jewelry. I mean, not every single item of jewelry was as expensive as the ones I've mentioned, but there was quite a lot of it, particularly hairpins. Actually, they were very big fans of hairpins from Cartier. Another example here as well of Helen wearing a wonderful pearl necklace. So looking, fairly modest, very glamorous, of course, but still fairly, I would say, modest here. And interesting that you have a reference here to her dear Papsy, so to Henry Clay Frick, the late Henry Clay Frick, founder of the Frick collection, her father, who is mentioning, and she's sort of writing here, stating that he had one of her pearl necklaces actually enlarged in 1919, sort of as a sort of a special gift for her. So really a sort of a touching reference there to show that these things were absolutely intimate possessions. They were considered very important to the family as well. And indeed, I think it speaks to our intimate relationship to jewelry today. It's still something that is it's worn on the body. We have an intimate connection to it, and all these symbolic associations, even if we don't exactly know where they originate from, whether it's Pliny or Philostrate or some of these ancient authors, they are still with us. They still inhabit us in many ways. An array of different jewels here which originally belonged to the Fricks and sometimes does match up with the inventory and the vouchers and the archives that we have here at the Frick. I thank my museum colleagues at the Frick Pittsburgh for providing me with this image, so thank you very much to Dawn in particular and to Lauren. And you have some of the boxes here that you can see, so particularly the characteristic red Cartier boxes, and also a wonderful sort of purple lavender box that is cited in the inventory, and that is a Tiffany box. The Fricks were particularly sort of big fans of Tiffany's or Tiffany & Co. at the time as it was known, and Cartier. So they were two of the biggest jewelry suppliers for the Fricks at the time. Now, I could not I could not do a presentation on jewelry in 2025 without referencing the rather disastrous and tragic situation at the Louvre that unfolded recently. In some ways, perhaps to put a vaguely positive spin on this really tragic occurrence, it does show that jewelry today is absolutely relevant. And these, I'm showing you here two of the extraordinary jewels that were unfortunately lost. And I feel, unfortunately, are probably lost forever, being recut and probably, refashioned and might appear on the market, 20 years from now. I mean, hopefully I'm wrong. I really hope I am. But just to show you the sort of levels of craftsmanship that were reached by, 19th century jewelers in this particular case. This fantastic tiara was made for Marie-Amélie of Bourbon-Sicile, of the Bourbon Two Sicilies, who was the wife and queen of France under Louis Philippe, King of the French in the middle of the 19th century, which has now been lost, sadly. But we, hopefully we can recover it. Let's keep hope here. But on a more positive light, and to end this lecture, I just want to say, as a British subject, I am part British. I did grow up in the UK, so I had to have a reference here to my British origins to a certain extent. Just to show that, crowns, to quote the late Queen Elizabeth II, crowns are rather important things. And indeed, one can see that when seeing Their Majesties Charles III and Queen Camilla wearing the imperial crown here and the Queen Mary's crown for their coronation. There we are. Jewels are still with us and still relevant today. Even though these traditions can seem bygone and rather ancient, they still have relevance and are still very potent even to this day in 2025. Thank you very, very much for listening.